I'd now like to hand over to the woman of the hour, Heather Elgood, who is kindly joining us now to introduce our keynote speaker today, Professor Naman Ahuja, and the chair of the Q&A to follow, Dr. Emily Shovelton. So Hetty, over to you to introduce the keynote speaker today. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone, wherever you are. I have to say I'm a little, how can I say, amazed, really. It's the only word I can use. And I'm enormously grateful, first of all, to Malcolm for arranging, and Patrick and Joe this day. But I'm completely touched by Shane. Thank you very, very much. I have to say I'm very confident now that this program will be embedded in the School of Arts, as I know Paul Webley wanted it to be. Thank you, Adam, for your words of confidence and praise for me. I look forward to properly meeting you and discussing the future. And I am here now to do something which means a great deal to me. And that is to introduce our keynote speaker of the day, Professor Naman Ahuja. Not only has he been a colleague, first of all, I have to admit, my student I never understand quite why I insisted on him coming all the way from India at the age of 21 to have an interview with me. He's never forgiven me for that. But I'm very proud that he was a student in 1995. He went on then to do his research, his PhD, to be a colleague, to redesign with me the India module, to work with me, to share our love and passion. I encouraged him to do research, which was enormously difficult for him because he said, but there are so many objects. I said, oh, yes, you'll be fine, you'll be fine. I'm sure he cursed me for all the number of objects that kept growing in the Ashmolean when he did the catalogue. But I have to say that our friendship, our sharing of our love for India, his helping me understand it intimately, I cannot tell you how much his energy, my working with him has been such a deep pleasure for me. And of course, I am the honor to be one of his 7 mothers. So this is the greatest honor of all. And I have to say more formally, because I had to write this down, that he says that the course or the India module forced him to learn about so many different chapters in the history of Indian art that he might never have done had he remained narrowly focused on his PhD subject. And of course, the closeness to the objects that we encouraged enabled him to have this holistic capacity as an art historian, and enabled him to go on not just to be an art historian, but also to put together the extraordinary museum exhibitions that he did. He's now Professor of Indian Art and Architecture, as Adam said, at the Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. As I said, he's worked as a curator on major exhibitions, most notably the Body in Indian Art and Thought in 2013. The other major exhibition and publication was India and the World, A History in 9 Stories in 2017, in which he staged strategic conversations between objects from the history of the world brought to India from the British Museum with Indian objects sourced from 25 Indian collections. How he managed to persuade them to allow him to actually take these objects from their collections is quite remarkable, I have to say. A further groundbreaking publication was The Art and Archaeology of Ancient India, published by the Ashmolean Museum in 2018, which was a result of years of his research and some agony, but he finally delivered it. Currently Dean of the School of Arts and Aesthetics at the University in Delhi. His studies on Indian art have explored also the aesthetics of Indian culture, iconography, transculturalism and antiquity, as well as the legacy of the arts and crafts movement in the modern period. In addition to all this, which is a fraction of what is achieved, I'm proud to say I've known Naman from his early years, watched him grow, shared our passion for tree spirits and goddesses, which I'll return to later on today. And as I've said, I always feel a little guilty for encouraging him to research such an enormous amount of material. But finally, to thank him for his immense generosity, giving from his energy, his passion, and himself in all that he shares, and for his friendship. Thank you, Naman.
Thank you very much, Hetty. It's really quite overwhelming to follow on with all of this and to think about the fact that you're not going to be there at SOAS in quite the same way. It's been a lifetime, and it is very emotional. I think the kind of personal handling that Professor Habib alluded to, that you have ensured of your colleagues and your students, is the attentiveness. Malcolm referred to the same thing. The follow-on on things has been as much of an education for me as has been the actual object handling that you have insisted on. My talk today is going to derive from that pedagogical method of object handling, and it's going to look at what are the politics around this kind of object handling. Where are we going with the kind of demands politically in museum objects and art history in the world today? And I'm going to allude to the complexities of the co-production of knowledge that Professor Habib referred to. How do we form a method for an equitable sharing in the process of generating knowledge? So those are some of the larger concerns that I hope to be able to bring to bear through an examination of object handling and how object handling can enable all of these things. The first thing to really talk about would be how provenance studies have emerged as one of the most important disciplinary aspects of art history. This is a subject which is directly concerned with politics and seeks to redress histories of political violence. Contained in the narratives that emerge when we study the provenance of objects are a variety of significant contexts. For instance, in our world of migrations, a pertinent one worth examining is the circumstances under which the owner of an object fled with the object which is now displayed in a museum. Was it an object of faith, a memento, or was it a much needed financial asset? And then, of course, there are many complex debates linked to questions about repatriation as a means to redress the political violence of the past. Each context makes us judge its current ownership differently. But other questions also emerge. In repatriation claims, does war booty belong to the usurper or to the vanquished? Or how far back can we go with provenance studies? And what is the right thing to do once we know the object's history? Can we bring cases of historical wrongs of 4 or 5 generations back into a court? Well, maybe that's acceptable and that's one matter, but can things that were done 20 or more generations ago still be brought to court today? The object, after all, now lives in a new context. The responsibility for the maintenance of the site and a material artifact has often been undertaken by a community which is different from the community that lost the object. And that maintenance may be taking place now in a manner that is perhaps different from how it was originally conceived, how the object was conceived. The context has changed. Can we be so impervious to change that the new home and context is disregarded? What does depriving current owners of an object achieve? Does it actually bring a museum visiting, conservation and museum maintaining habit to the country to which the object is going to be repatriated? After all, at some point, the deracinated or the uprooted also become naturalized in their new homes. none of these questions can be answered without acknowledging the role propaganda and perception play. In the past few years, demands for restitution or repatriation have started intensifying because of the delay in admitting a narrative of decolonization in Western museums. In 2020, the Black Lives Matter movement brought long-standing histories of racial and colonial violence into sharper focus, with the destruction of public statuary in some places, and even the creation of new statues to replace those where colonizers once stood. If provenance histories of many objects and the biographies of the collectors had been openly exposed for a few decades, perhaps the honest rationale for Western museums to continue to act as custodians of those objects that told complex histories, might actually have been justified. But now, however, in an age of hyper-nationalism, we are left asking a parallel question about what really is driving the desire for repatriation in countries like India. Whose benefit is the narrative or propaganda of restitution serving? The narrative accompanying Indian sculptures is one of the restitution of a sacred object to the country it once belonged to, even if that object is no longer capable of being brought back into worship. In times when religion is being used to bolster nationalism, the return of historical artifacts serves a very different propaganda than what objects can communicate. The many other diverse histories that object can communicate. Repatriation can bolster India's national pride today as a reaction to the possession of objects from diverse parts of the world that once encouraged colonial pride and empire building in Europe and in Britain. Some have argued that in the UK, public institutions and school curricula could have done more to stem the rising national chauvinism in Britain in the past 2 decades, much of which has been associated with a nostalgia for empire. Large proportions of the citizens of the West have roots in countries that were formerly colonized, on the other hand, whose histories of how they came to be uprooted or why the objects of their previous countries are now in European countries are seldom told in public institutions. The delay in a decolonizing narrative has cost Western institutions by alienating their publics, which are diverse. The decolonization narrative is thus not for India's benefit anymore, but one that the US, Britain, and European countries need to maintain their own cosmopolitanism. In India, decolonization may have been an issue that was important from the 1930s until the 1970s for righting colonial wrongs, but there are now many other more pressing matters that affect Indian art in terms of what markets and museums need to understand, in terms of what museums can enable, and how these things need to be protected. Colonial wrongs and inequities may remain, but issues around violence perpetrated on the basis of caste, religion, gender, climate, biodiversity, individual rights, and the right to knowledge, and the freedom to speak are pressing concerns in India that cannot be addressed only through a narrative of decolonization or a narrative of repatriation. In today's talk, I'd like to draw attention to one field of disinformation, or at least misinformation, that remains unaddressed when viewing antique sculptures in public museums in India. My focus is to reveal the many types of political violence communicated by ancient and medieval Indian sculptures. Objects in Indian museum collections raise questions, and the museum has a role and a responsibility to play in articulating the many narratives these questions provoke. For all the intentions that exist on paper on the interpretive role museum displays can play in fulfilling their mandate of contributing to the development of a responsible or even an enlightened public, few Indian museum curators have demonstrated their capacity to exhibit this in the permanent displays of Indian history, except to use these objects largely as tools for telling a history of religion or of metaphysical ideas, whereas there are actually several reasons for taking the museum from being storehouses of objects to communicators of ideas and diverse or even divergent histories. In the longer published version of the essay from which today's talk derives, I examine how telling stories of political violence in the public sphere has a long history in Indian culture, so much so that it was debated as to how artfully these stories of conflict should be communicated and what is the desirable aesthetic effect it should lead to. Now, we haven't got time to go into all of that today, but it is worth remembering that the spirit of communicating narratives of violence and conflict is a long-standing part of the Indian tradition. I'll focus instead on some case studies today on how museums, which are the aesthetic communicators of history and cultural identity nowadays, can perform this role in the public sphere. In today's paper, I've tried to take us on a little journey to trace the enormous shift in what the discipline of art history is now responding to. We were all educated at an introductory level through a lens of connoisseurship to understand chronology, to understand form, iconography, and style of the artworks in our curriculum. In time, the contexts in which these objects were made became better known to scholarship. These contextualized studies, here we are, have reinforced interdisciplinarity and made it evident that art history is necessary to be able to tell histories of science, technology, communication, climate change, apart from issues such as religion, which it has served for many centuries. Now, these have been concerns that museums have increasingly attended to for the past 40 years, and it was this richness of stories that objects can tell that expanded the appeal of BBC's Radio 4 and Penguin Books' History of the World in 100 Objects. However, in these past 2 decades, along with globalization, have come strong forces of parochialism and a requirement to resolve conflicts of old. The capacity of the British Museum to be able to tell a history of the world has not been appreciated by those living in colonized parts of the world, those who cannot afford to visit the BM. Their poverty and now the planetary precarity that we are confronted with prevents them from sharing the knowledge that their objects enable for those who are in Bloomsbury. Questions thus are raised on whether their inequity can itself become the subject of museum discourse, and how might the labels and captions that accompany objects communicate that. One such endeavor was the collaboration brokered between Indian museums and the British Museum that allowed us to stage a massive temporary exhibition called India and the World, A History in 9 Stories in 2017. The exhibition served not just the moral requirement for the BM to share its collections with Indians, but equally to embark on a co-production of knowledge, one that could tell the story of the world not just through Western eyes, but also through an Indian vision. Again, we haven't the time available for me to take you through how this was done in the exhibition, but one thing that became clear was the requirement to see India itself as a culture that was not just united by its religions or its spiritualism, that diverse histories could be gleaned from India's objects on science, technology, politics, and migrations, and even violence and conflict, just as it was possible to tell those histories from other parts of the world. So what I'm going to do in my talk today is try and show how art history can respond to these current requirements in the South Asian context. I'm going to move beyond the point about the requirement to declare the provenance history of objects in museums to an examination of other kinds of conflict, such as political conflict or gendered violence or religious conflict, for instance. The politics of conflict over religious and cultural identity is dependent on how a community's history is imagined or constructed. Constructing current political agendas on historical wrongs is commonplace and reflects how conflicts in history are being contextualized. Yet for all the many representations of a history from one party's standpoint, there is equally the silencing of someone else's perspective. Marginalized or even written out, the erasure leads to further conflictual situations, which again are taken advantage of by the establishment's propaganda. Understanding how conflicts are exacerbated and what causes them is imperative if we want to find ways to at least cope with them, if not diminish their intensity or try and resolve them. Kashmir's great aesthetician from the 9th century, Anandavardhan, and its famous historian from the 12th century, Kalhan, both held an interesting view on this subject. They believed that the repeated telling of stories of bloodshed, as in the vividly captured accounts of carnage and sorrows in the Mahabharata, would prevent further conflict. Rather than merely instilling heroism or what we call Veer Rasa, they believed that such tales fostered an understanding of how even the pursuit of dharma is tinged with the vanity of self-righteousness and could reveal the all too human condition of an entrapment by the ego. Repeatedly telling audiences the Mahabharata stories, they said, would expose how conflict works and thus lead to tranquility or Shanta Rasa. These views point to the larger social and cultural role of even gratuitous violence in the depictions of art and in performances, which have been justified on the grounds of didacticism and catharsis. Now, with labels or even museum catalogs that seek to identify the iconography of an artwork, its material and its date, the museum, by just limiting itself to these 3 points in the museum label, the museum abrogates itself from telling the many other important histories of who patronized that object, who destroyed it, who rescued it or copied it, and most importantly, why they did so. Indian art suffers from the most atavistic types of presentation. It is either divided into 19th century colonial arts and industry type of displays of works of bronze making, stone carving, manuscripts, woodwork, decorative art, a material-wise division, which was devised at a time to be able to tell the world what India could or had manufactured. Or to borrow the historian Ramila Thapar's phrase, Indian art suffers from the tyranny of labels, displayed in categories of Buddhist art, Hindu art, and Muslim period art. There is little consideration for the fact that Hindu art continued to be made in Buddhist and Muslim periods, that Hinduism is not an eternal religion, but a constantly changing society, or that similarly, all Muslim art cannot be sequestered into one block. Objects in museums are pieces of historical evidence that clearly reveal the overlaps and complexities of multiple narratives of the times in which they were made. By contrast, now this is a photograph I took at the Landis Museum in Zurich. The Landis Museum is the national museum in Zurich, and it tells in it, at least it told, a fantastic and well thought out narrative about identity. Its curatorial team took the decision to open the museum by asking the public, who is a Swiss person? What is the nature of Swiss identity? Bold questions for a museum to ask right at the outset. The galleries reflect on the history of different racial, cultural, and religious strains that have gone into making the multilingual, multicultural fabric of their country. And in fact, the museum concludes in a rather jocular, self-deprecating vein with a confident parody of Swiss identity as a land of milk, cheese, cowbells, chocolates, and clocks. The Byzantine and Christian Museum of Athens and the Museum of Byzantine Culture in Thessaloniki are government museums that also make for a worthy comparison. The complexity of informing the public of how their Christian sacred shrines were built by using the remains of buildings made by other communities is done in a clear and an anodyne tone. The Athens Museum's first few galleries clearly reveal how early Christian shrines were built on the notion of triumph over existing Roman markers of culture, honoring new martyrs and confessors of the Christian faith. That's a screen grab of the virtual tour you can take through their museum, and you can read some of the labels that they have in their museum displays, which are wonderful in their admission of the kind of civilizational violence that their land has seen. Now, the same museum extends to the period of the Crusades, and again, does not shy away from showing objects that reveal how people of one culture appropriated the sacred and what we may call today the inalienable cultural markers of another community. It reveals the all too violent history of the end of paganism, the rise of Christianity, and the advent of Islam. In the United States, which is known to be pro-Israel, a new museum of oral history called the Museum of the Palestinian People opened in Washington, D.C. in 2019. Rare, however, is the display of South Asian art, where multiple points of view are presented to the public to explain why it is difficult to have one standpoint and thus problematize history in the museum. Instead, the tone taken is of limited pronouncements. How can we start making a shift in what we communicate through our labels? Well, I think if we try to look, for instance, at a case study of how you can look at the matter of political violence, I think statues of martyrdom make for a particularly good example for this. In my exhibitions, I tried to demonstrate this through a comparison of a large number of hero stones and statues of martyrs. There is also a rich tradition of building cenotaphs or chhatris in India over the dead, or marking the spot where somebody was cremated. Memorials or hero stones or even large temples were built across the length and breadth of South Asia to commemorate warriors who had died a violent death on the battlefield. These hero stones often use iconography derived from the Mahabharata that shows pious warriors sacrificing themselves. As you can see here, this man has cut himself so violently that you can see his intestines spilling out of his body as he is disemboweling himself, and ascending to heaven to be greeted by queens or celestial maidens or apsaras. You can see the two chowri bearers on either side waiting for him as their reward for the martyr when he was to go up to heaven. This one happens to come from Telangana in southeast India and is dated to about the 13th century. It made a very important point because the dominant political narrative in the news for the past 15 years has been that of jihad, and how the jihadi is the one who goes up to be met by the Hur Paris when he rises to heaven. And here is a similar parallel in Indian mythology and in evidence from Indian statuary that similar kinds of rewards are held out in another body of texts from another part of the world, also in another religion, where too martyrs were commemorated. Without having to then be absolutely explicit about the matter in the museum label, the point was driven home. This was connected in another part of the same display in the exhibition with this particular print that was widely in circulation during the Indian freedom movement, during the national movement. It comes from the early part, from the 1940s, I think, in the region of Uttar Pradesh, from Kanpur. And it shows the leader of the Indian National Army who took up arms against the British during the Second World War, showing himself as sacrificing himself. Subhash Chandra Bose has decapitated himself, rather like the hero stone iconography that we just looked at from the 13th century, similarly. And the blood of Subhash Chandra Bose is flowing down to make the map of India. The map of India, which is made with his blood, has the national proclamation Jai Hind written on it, the nationalist slogan. So ingrained was the visual iconography of dramatic self-sacrifice that graphic artists used it for the propaganda posters of the Indian national movement. Now, self-sacrifice for the sake of the country was politically glorified to such an extent that there were innumerable public monuments built to commemorate these freedom fighters, making this kind of violence normative, a valid social aspiration. So when we start talking about how our people turned into jihadis, how is it a valorized sentiment? Well, we only have to look at how the propaganda machinery works through the instruments of visual culture and art history to be able to do so. Let's look at some other examples in the case, for instance, of gendered violence. Now, again, there are many examples that I could potentially have raised, but I'm just going to use one or two examples, really. The period between the 7th to the 10th centuries, which saw a steady rise in India of emancipatory verses of female bhakti saints, also witnessed a hardening of patriarchal tendencies that restricted women's agency. This, for instance, is a remarkable statue of a Tirthankar from the Jain pantheon called Mallinath. Whereas ancient sources regarded the Jain Tirthankar Mallinath as a female, by the 11th century, her gender was changed to male. This happened with growing discomfiture in the Jain community on the subject of female nudity, because nudity was an essential requirement within the faith for the Tirthankar. They began to believe that a woman was incapable of achieving moksha, and the only way she could aspire to attain moksha was to lead such an exemplary life that she would have the good fortune to be born in her next life as a man, because as a man, she could then pursue her goal to moksha, to get out of the cycle of samsara and never be reborn. And that was a door that was closed to a woman. This sculpture was made or found at a town called Unnao. Unnao is in Uttar Pradesh. It's been a site where some of the most beastly rape cases have taken place, and one has really hit the headlines in the past 2 years. What forces at Unnao perpetrated such violence on this statue of a female who dared to sit mindfully nude, brave, beautiful, an exquisite plait falling down her upright back, with a single jasmine in her palm? There are grounds to believe that the image was removed from worship as much by patriarchal forces at Unnao as by iconoclasts who demanded its destruction. Or let's look at this. In the case of women, even death could not free them from patriarchal prejudice. Sati was commemorated widely all over South Asia. Usually it's thought of as something that the Rajputs did or something that happened only in North India. This is an object from the Chennai Museum, and it's it comes from the Telangana territory. And again, we had it on display. And the important thing about it is not just that this is made as a commemorative statue, but it was how has it been regarded over the centuries? What's the context in which this object has been used for the past 700 years? What have people done with this statue? Conducting worship at such public monuments to female ancestors who had committed sati served the purpose of normalizing this violence against women in society. So we pushed the envelope. We talked about how this happens, how this kind of value system is ingrained through these artworks, what civilizational significance these sculptures therefore hold. It's about reading the sculpture and asking questions of it. What's the inscription on it? Which is the society that viewed it? Where was it positioned in its original context before it found its way in the museum? And the museum label, therefore, has a role to be able to inform the public about that kind of role that this statue has played. Or let's look at this example. Similar to that male hero stone, here we have a female hero stone, a Veera Sati. Now, at first glance, this memorial appears to give the female soldier the same status as the male soldier. But a more careful look reveals that the similarity perhaps has been carried just a little too far. The woman here is accompanied also by female apsaras or celestials who typically wait upon the male soldiers when they ascended to heaven. Now, was the artist so oblivious to female desire? Was it that the same society that believed in sati to protect a woman's honor could not conceive that a female warrior may have men waiting for her in heaven? Was it possible that the normative rule that in Hindu society that marriages take place for 7 generations was such that the wife or the female soldier could not now be seen with a different man? So what was it that made it normative for sculptures of female warriors to also always be shown with female apsaras waiting on them? Let's move to another case, religious conflict. Now, there are many examples of this all over South Asia, but I would like to show you how a museum label can work. In 2017, the British Museum rewrote the label that accompanies this sculpture, which shows an older statue of the Buddha on one side, which was destroyed and defaced, turned around, and a mihrab for a mosque was carved on the other side. the British Museum holds this piece and has put it on display prominently in the museum gallery, in the Shovelton gallery. Importantly, in the writing of the label, they have taken a tone which is factual and non-partisan. So let's just look at their label. It says, the Buddha and the Mihrab. This side of the panel shows an Islamic mihrab surrounded by floral scrolls indicating the direction of Makkah and therefore the direction for prayer. The other shows the Buddha flanked by bodhisattvas. The figures have been damaged, full stop. The sculpture of the Buddha was made in the AD 900s. The back of the stone slab was carved as a mihrab in the 1400s when the Bengal Sultanate was in power. Full stop. I mean, it could have been used so many ways. It could have been written in so many ways that could have lent a little tone that was incendiary, that was partisan. Something like that could have happened. But what the museum has done here is communicated factually. And that's important. It's important to be able to do it in that tone. I'm talking to you while I'm sitting in front of the Qutub Minar in Delhi. And the Archaeological Survey of India's guidebook that has been brought out to take people through the Qutub Minar, which has many statues of spolia, many examples of spolia and Hindu statuary which have been reused or repurposed into the Quwwatul Islam Mosque, leaves the reader with a definite tone of perpetrating and further being almost incendiary in its tone, firing up passions rather than taking a tone which is more responsible. You can read extracts from that in the longer version of this paper that was published by the Collège de France in an article called Discourse on a Label. I'll give you the citation to it if you're interested at the end of the lecture. And let's look at another example. This was an example that I displayed in the Body in Indian Art exhibition. It has a statue of the Buddhist Tara on the one side, which was turned around and carved into an Ardhanarishwar Hindu sculpture of the conjoined Shiva and Parvati, which was the side that appears to have been used in worship because it's the one that is smooth and clean and not pitted. The carved relief of Ardhanarishwara is in the front, so to say, and the Tara is at the back. Islamic iconoclasm has usually been thought of, as we were looking at it in the previous example, as the only reason for the destruction of Indian images. However, as you can see with this example, that's not the case. This double-sided image shows a beautiful Ardhanarishwar in the front, and at the back, a corroded image of the Buddhist Tara, revealing that a Buddhist shrine may have been appropriated by a Shaivite sect of Hindus. Now, of course, there could be other reasons for this. There could be the fact that a patron had commissioned the Tara and changed his mind or her mind and wanted an Ardhanarishwar instead and didn't want to spend on a new block of stone, so asked the sculptor to turn it around and carve on the other side and donated the Ardhanarishwar to the temple instead. Perfectly plausible explanation. But were it that this was just the only example that was there, then it would be one thing. But there are many examples where we've seen Buddhist shrines being converted into Hindu ones, or a certain competitiveness between the two religions in multiple ways, where the active agent could be Buddhist or Hindu. It happens from both sides as the perpetrator. Let's look at some more examples quickly. Here, for instance, you have a Jain Tirthankar called Ajit Nath, found in Orissa. Now, this is an interesting example of showing how discarding sculptures and then reappropriating them does not just happen because of religious conflict only. They can be cast away for a variety of reasons and in several prescribed ritual ways. What happens to discarded works? These days, many are commandeered for museum displays, but sometimes when superstitions abounded on how they became repositories for evil spirits, care was taken to leave them buried or cooled in water by placing them in wells or rivers. And a group of 5-6 statues was found of different Jain Tirthankaras from the rivers of Bhadrak district in Odisha. Their bodies have all been found with these curious incisions. They've been used to grind metal tools, probably axes or arrows or swords. What happened to these Jain Tirthankaras? This was one, this is another. And here is another one. These sculptures that I've shown you just now are lying in the Bhubaneswar Museum. And it is particularly ironic because these are the bodies of Jain Tirthankaras. Tirthankaras embody ahimsa or non-violence. And it is their bodies that have been used to sharpen tools or weapons. There could have been many reasons why a Jain temple fell out of use in the first instance, and then how these sculptures began to be used to grind metal and then were discarded in the river because they were all retrieved from the river at Bhadrak. I have many more slides of the field work I conducted in that river, studying the stones in that river to see if there were other examples, and there are many others over there. Spolia, defaced images, and acts of violence revealed by sculptures are common in museums. Iconoclasm is one type of violence perpetrated on images, but of violence there are several examples. It can arise out of political conflict and be normalized, as we've seen, through martyrdom. It can be gendered or perpetrated because of class, caste, or, as we can see perhaps with these sculptures, out of economic necessity. It could stem from a requirement to reuse the materials that made up discarded shrines. As my talk's case studies have demonstrated, these factors could easily be made visible to the museum-going public only if the museum was willing to present the available research on them. Explanatory texts that detail the history of an object, its biography, and the difficulty faced by curators or researchers in locating and interpreting a single cause for the damage inflicted on that sculpture make the evidence public rather than leave the matter to the viewer's imagination, or worse, leave that field open to misrepresentation. The case studies in today's talk are only a select few from a much larger and ever-expanding file on sculptures that reveal the problems in tracing their vandalism to any one causative agent. When they were exhibited in the Body and Indian Art exhibition at Europalia, Brussels, at the Palais des Beaux-Arts in 2013, and then at the National Museum in Delhi in 2014, there was a careful editing of the labels, along with further communication of the works provided through short films. There was also an opening up of online discussions to communicate to the public what the possible reasons for the breakage were, and that there were several such possible reasons. Each work inspired further research. This representation stood in contrast to the many Indian sites of conflict where the lack of explication has left a gap that has been openly hijacked for propaganda, often making it seem that Islamic iconoclasm was the only factor behind violence. Without going into the many Holocaust museums of the 20th century, examples from government-funded museums in other major national capitals in the world with rich histories and problems of immigration, whether it was Athens or London or Zurich or Washington, DC, as I just mentioned, have all taken an approach to see what can be done with ancient artifacts in order to admit the longer history of conflict. They highlight how both sides of an object and a story can be shown. And finally, how the museum has dealt with its job of being able to display and narrate that evidence. By problematizing the material, the onus, not of judgment, but of discussion of the evidence, thus shifts onto the public, making that public participants, complicit in the act of history writing. Stage your problem for the public. Make them a part of the issue. The Babri Masjid, the Buddhas of Bamiyan, or any other examples cited that we may want to cite, reveal that smashing sculptures or buildings is not a new field for propaganda. However, the complex historical circumstances under which theft and iconoclasm were perpetrated is seldom communicated through the museum label. These acts must be understood in their own time and context, when they were performed for the sake of a certain cause that sought demonstration of the usurpation of someone else's power. These cases also show how images and even iconography have been used to normalize conflict and make public statements about it. Exposing this allows audiences to wisen up to the techniques that are employed in making public statements through objects and through architecture, rather than be as the innocent or naive receiving end of the methods, or become upset about how propaganda is being used. Because we haven't done our job in educating the public adequately, as this is how public statuary and architecture is often used. The necessity to inform the public about the complex ways in which identity is formed through visual history both protects the public institution that houses the evidence and ensures a more interesting engagement with viewers who aren't didactically instructed on facts, but are made aware about what art historians, archaeologists, and other social scientists do. What is our job? In fact, many a museum of contemporary art nowadays, I put art in inverted commas, relies on this approach of using the museum space for what they call transitional justice or memorialization, enabling visitors to assume responsibility for a conflict and own up to their role in perpetrating that conflict, rather than apportion blame to someone else. Art historical and archaeological evidence, often kept in museums, is as rich a source for narrating histories of conflict today as were the most famous epic and dramatic texts from times past. Museums house important artifacts that are critical evidence that for writing history, and conflicting narratives, even divergent views on history, which can be built up within the museum space. Yet, museum objects are often, especially in India, neglected or so poorly showcased that no one wants to hear the rich stories they have to tell. Or they are fashionably displayed in what we call the white cube display, where they're given the pithiest possible label to identify them for fear of over-determining the viewer's perception of the objects, or for fear of distracting from their aesthetic pleasure. This acts actually sometimes as a bit of a ruse, protecting the museum from stating anything that may be perceived as bringing to light a story of conflict. And thus, in failing to make the very object speak for the relevance it may have to its audience, the museum goes back to being a neglected space, or worse, by not talking about it and by silencing history, it is perhaps perpetrating the worst kind of violence of all. As I come to conclude my talk today, I wish to reinforce that using museum objects for studies on social context or political history, or any other type of history for that matter, can only be done once the tools and methods for visual communication of art are known to the writer. Every painting, sculpture, or any type of object is made using a specific technology, and the study of forms, style, and artistic technique of craftsmanship is a core foundation for being able to correctly date an object or contextualize it. As teachers and shapers of the curriculum then, this increasing requirement for interdisciplinarity has increased our work, as jumping into social and political history without knowing how to read the visual source material causes embarrassing mistakes. It is for this reason that I titled today's talk, From Date, Style and Iconography to a History of Conflict in the Changing Didactics of Museum Labels. Many curators and connoisseurs have put down their views on the topic of museums and labels, asking whether a physical artwork can or cannot communicate without the aid of a written narrative. The answer is that it can. And as every artistically sensitive person knows, reading visual communication is as important as being able to read a written text. Yet today, when exhibition display techniques are so much more advanced, with layers of narrative that are linked to the biography of each object, we cannot justify robbing an object of its many stories that can be easily communicated through a range of written or oral tools. It is in this context that the role of the museum label needs to be expanded, and so must our pedagogy in what we ask students to write when we ask them to write catalogue entries. But this leads us to a big concern. Who decides which histories need to be told and how? Subjective appreciation of such matters will always remain, but asking the questions of the material itself is needed. Left in the hands of the government, the museum, which is the visible showcase for the discipline of art history, remains in the grasp of fickle political vote bank garnering publicists, and does not really end up serving the cause of the many social sciences that archaeology and art history feed. Autonomy to research and the responsibility to communicate their narratives is certainly what is needed by museums in India. In such situations, the style and the skill of writing are as important as the information that we are trying to communicate. The attention to language cannot be seen as being secondary to any claim to the presentation of facts. Can the training and selection of museum curators give as much emphasis to writing as it needs to give to exhibition design and the capacity to identify the date and style of an artifact? In an age of both disinformation and misinformation, will research remain a focus of the museum professional? Without addressing such questions, I'm afraid museum studies and art history personnel will never really rise to the ways in which their peers are beginning, the expectation their peers often have of them in forming our institutions and education systems. It was, for me, a great personal journey to really take you through this arc, because it was how I started, what I started with, and what I've ended up doing. And I hope I can give this to you, Hetty, as a small homage to where the course has come. And I have come with you on this journey, along with everyone else, on what the course has enabled. Thank you very much.
Naman, thank you so much for your wonderful lecture, the critical insights, the way you are taking our whole field forward, not only the field of Indian art history, but the wider art historical discourse, and for always looking to the future and holding us to a higher standard of rigor and reflection. That's hugely appreciated. I'd now like to introduce the moderator for the following Q&A that will begin now, Dr. Emily Shovelton. Dr. Shovelton is a specialist in the art of the Islamic and Persianate world of South Asia. Her recent projects and publications include contributions to a forthcoming volume on the Nasir di Khalili collection of Islamic art and a recent symposium on the arts of the Indian Sultanates organised at Wolfson College, Oxford. Dr. Shovelton completed her PhD at SOAS in 2009 while working as an assistant curator at the British Museum. And I'm thrilled to say that she has been a long-standing supporter of the postgraduate diploma in Asian art as a convener, tutor and lecturer on both our Islamic art modules and our Indian art module. I'm particularly pleased to say that she will be convening the forthcoming Indian art module this autumn. So Emily, over to you. Thank you once again, Naman. And please do post your questions in the chat, in the Q&A box that appears on the lower right-hand side of your screen for those of you in the audience. So Emily, Naman, over to you.
Thank you very much, Malcolm. Before I just move to Naman, someone's impatient outside your door. I would also like to, personally, I just want to thank Hetty for encouraging me to teach for the course and all that I have learned from her over the years, after many years now. So firstly, I just want to offer a huge and warm thank you from me to Hetty. I'm delighted to be able to chair Naman's talk today and celebrate the close relationship, Naman, that you've had with Hetty and the diploma for many years. And thank you for such an excellent talk that I'm sure there are going to be lots of questions. I think I can see some bubbling away there. And I think what you did so perfectly honours Hetty from what she's achieved with the course, with the SOAS postgraduate diploma. It honours her vital legacy, not just to the course, but to SOAS more widely and the field, and her drive to encourage students to encounter the objects closely. I particularly appreciate that, and keep the objects at the centre of their research. But at the same time, your talk is challenging us and is acknowledging new exciting directions that Malcolm is embracing so successfully, and encouraging us to harness this detailed knowledge obtained from an object-based course, and also bringing new context to our cataloguing, new narratives that these objects are set within, new stories they can tell. How do we address issues of violence and decolonization in a sensitive way? And how can we inform, but I really like what you were saying towards the end, how can we inform, but not just be givers of facts for audiences to absorb, but also allow them to claim it for themselves and engage in a more active way. So I think I'm allowed as chair to ask a question first. I suppose I wanted to ask, I've got a few questions, but the first one, I appreciate again what you were saying about not suggesting that we throw away a focus on iconography and close observation and production, but addressing political debates, claiming these for ourselves, and so that we can present them in a most sort of partisan way, the multiple viewpoints. I mean, the one that really chimed with me in my research was the Buddhist carving that's in down the road at BM, with the Buddha carved on one side and the mihrab on the back, the one from Bengal, is a fascinating object. And you highlight how well that label has been written and how it has achieved a sort of this non-partisan approach. So I suppose my question is sort of relating also to what Adam was saying, Adam Habib, at the beginning, of how more directly can you advise us in your wisdom after all these years? How can you advise us as on the course, as teachers, as students, and how we can move forward, I guess. Just, yeah, it's my first question. Sorry, long one.
Well, thanks, Emily. I think it's important to widen what we mean, and I can give you a very simple practical answer to the question, which is that in the cataloging part of the exercise, the marks we give for contextualization we really need to spend a little bit more time on what we expect out of that section on contextualization. We've all got a great sheet that we work as teachers with. So much for description, so much for justification for the attribution, and so much for the provenance and understanding these things. But in terms of contextualization, we need to be able to think about how much importance we're giving it. And then we need to take our students through practical exercises on what do we really mean by contextualization? And what are the different kinds of contexts that we expect them to attend to in their writing? I think the habit of being able to use the visual source material to be able to do other things with it is essential to be able to gain that skill and knowledge right from the beginning when they enter the discipline. That it's about why it is necessary to understand form and style and to be able to read the art history from a connoisseurial lens, and then to be able to say that now that I know how to read an image and I know what it is trying to communicate, then to be able to put down what is it aesthetically trying to do, and what is the aesthetic milieu in which it exists, and what is the socio-political or cultural or scientific or other milieu in which I can read this same object. I guess it might sound platitudinous to some people who've been doing it already, but it is surprising how little it is done within our field, actually.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I might just, if you don't mind, seeing as we've got quite a lot of time, ask one more, actually just even more sort of personal question, just because this is why we're here. We're here to celebrate Hetty and the course, and you're here as having a long-standing relationship with it and her. And I wondered if you have any particular memories of Hetty and her pedagogy over the years, maybe particularly in the early years. I mean, I'm just thinking we've got this wonderful audience here, hello audience, sorry, I didn't say hello properly, who are many current students, perhaps alumni, and lots of others who are interested. You know, have you got specific memory that would be really wonderful for us to hear about your being a student or when you first began teaching on the course?
Well, as Hetty said in her introduction to me, I've never let her forget about the fact that I needed a scholarship to be able to take the course at the first instance, but she asked me to come for an interview. And I had to fly across all the way from India to come to London for an interview. It was a remarkable flight. All kinds of wonderful things happened. I met great people on that flight that became friends for life. And I was interviewed and selected. And then I came to study on the program, and there were things, some of the lectures, I mean, I found the lectures fascinating because there was this, you got the absolute expert on a subject, not people, everyone who'd done different PhDs on different sides of South Asia or different aspects of Islamic or Southeast Asian art, who were all coming in with their bibliographies. And I amassed a phenomenal set of bibliographies. And I took on a job in the SOAS library to start shelving the books. And I started doing that every morning before classes began. And I got to know the art floor's shelving better than anyone else, because I knew where every single book was meant to be. And it gave me the time in the evenings to actually go to the library and know what to pull out and what to look at. And it set up a journey for me, which was quite exciting. I got more and more into the field. And at some point, there were certain lecturers, and I was quite outspoken, and I went to Hetty and I said, this really isn't up to scratch. And this is very old school. And I remember some of the lectures on the Sultanate, particularly.
Oh, really?
Had me absolutely enraged. I was very upset by the lectures I'd heard on the coming of the different sultanates to India and the establishment of the sultanates. I mean, it seemed like it was positively Victorian knowledge that was being passed on to us. It was so laden with prejudiced adjectives in the whole thing, and And that kind of like set a certain tone for the entire presentation of Islam in general. And it was sort of not very PC. So I was complaining about this, and Hetty retorted, well, if you think you know so much about it and if you can do it so much better, why don't you do the lecture next year?
That's funny. Yes, I think I do remember us even having conversations now, man, years ago when I started the BM. But I think what you've highlighted is also a very important part that Hetty's been so passionate about, which is making sure we have experts on all their subjects. That's what we still have. We have them talking today.
And well, the point about that is that as I went from one side of the classroom to the other and started standing behind the table in order to be able to do the lectures myself, that allowed me to embark on a whole other and very important part of my real education. And that was the opportunity, more than studying on the diploma, the opportunity to become a participant in shaping the curriculum and teaching on the diploma, that I am truly very grateful to Hetty for. Because I think becoming a pedagogue and the demands that come with it and the responsibilities that have to be shouldered do make you take on a much larger view of a subject. And doing that concurrently alongside my PhD allowed me to keep growing much more widely in my reading and doing more in the library, as I was saying, and in the museum. And then the other, I must say this, that, you know, I'm giving this talk which was all about what you can do with your knowledge by learning how to handle objects in the first place. It was only because of the experience of working with shards and paintings and handling the physical object and its tactility. The paradox is that we are talking about this in a digital age, but the point is that the object exists in a certain sensorium, and learning to handle the object was germane, because only then could I really see the kind of things that I'm talking about now, which is how was it broken? Was it broken with a single smash, or was it broken painstakingly with a hammer and chisel for a long time? How long does it take to actually decapitate that statue? How long does it take to actually start decapitating the 100 statues in a temple? And these are not just knocked off in a pre-dynamite age, just like that. It's not easy. It takes a lot of effort. And if you're doing that kind of, if you're investing that kind of effort into the physical exercise of demolition or making it means that you are spending a lot of time, effort, and energy to communicate your message. And that decapitation or that broken statue or taking it off a public square is there to make a certain statement. And those statements are as important as the iconography, which is what we were studying. So object handling really does take you into a finer appreciation of the context. And I just wanted to make that clear. I mean, these were some of my great learnings from the program.
I think that is such a good point. And also sort of looping back to what you were saying earlier about how broad the course forced you to be. And I think, I have to say, as teaching, being as a teacher, but I also know from the student perspective, it can be very daunting, how much we cover and how much we're expected to engage with. But it is also a powerful tool, and it's a strength. And it reflects in your study, in your writing, and in everything you've done. You are a polymath, aren't you? You've touched on many areas. Anyway, I feel I must go to the questions now. So I'm opening a little tab, and I can see quite a long one, but I'm going to go ahead and read this one from Natalia, who says...
Well, I'm looking at the question too. Is it Natalia's question?
Yes. Can you...
Yes, I've managed to call it up, and I'm looking at it. And I think, Natalia, you've really summarized a lot of the issues that I've been talking about. And the issue of knowing how to make an object and how it feels and what its viewing distance is, really help you understand the context. One of the things that we always try and do is that when we have a photograph of a decontextualized statue from a temple context, from a temple. One has to try and always understand that, was this to be seen 20 feet up? Was this to be seen eye level? If it was 20 feet up, it performed a very different function. If it was eye level, it was meant for direct worship. Where do you position this? Writing up a catalog entry, therefore, is all about knowing your visual perception skill. And so I think the balance that you're asking me about as to how much information one gives to technique and connoisseurship versus history writing really is, you've got to be able to attend to both. And you've got to know a little bit about method and material and dating and style and art movements and fashions. And at the same time, you've got to have an interest in history and different kinds of history.
Naman, do you mind if I just rather rudely interrupt you? I realise now seeing the chat, but actually I think only I can see the questions, only you and I can.
Oh, I see.
I can't see them. So just Natalia's asked an excellent question, which as Naman just said, really sums up what he's saying, which is you have to embrace all different aspects. And Natalia's asking how we get the balance between the visual delight of the artifact, the technical skill of the artist, the methods of presentation, execution, etc., with the reading and narrating history through works of art. It's a really good question. Perhaps we'll get Patrick to send it out afterwards. Anyway, sorry, Nama, did you have anything else to say on that for the next one? No, okay. So thank you for that question. And I now have another one, which says, wonderful lecture, Naman. So miss these SOAS lectures, so nourishing. I suppose your approach on labeling can also be applied to how one looks at the object, one's physical vantage point, which is based on how the object is used. Can it not? Sorry, get the intonation right. Not always on frontal view, face to face. They're more lined up against a gallery wall, etc., but requiring a walk around, circumambulation, which I found so wonderful to discover when I saw the Kerma statues in Penn, sorry, I'm going to pronounce that wrong, museum, which is actually, that's very relevant to that museum, to that object we were talking about, which I think used to be set against a wall and now is right in the middle. So sorry, over to you, Naman.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's exactly what I was saying as well, that looking at just a photograph or seeing them on a museum, against a museum wall, we oftentimes forget how the object was really used or could be actioned. And one of the big mistakes and great learning for me was when I was doing the Body in Indian Art exhibition, when I began to see that there were so many more three-dimensional Indian sculptures than I had previously known about, because I had always imagined that many Indian sculptures were actually very deep reliefs, which they are. They're very deep reliefs because they are within a stele, but actually there are sculptures, many sculptures, which are in the round, even though they were on temple walls, but they were set ahead of the background architecture on a projecting plinth or bracket. And there are many in the National Museum as well in Delhi, which have unfortunately, like the Phnom Penh situation, where, not like the Phnom Penh, but like many other world museums, which have been lined up against the wall, so you can't really appreciate the sculpting in the round. So that is a concern. And as I was saying earlier, another big problem is the height at which things should be viewed. Many temples are massive structures, and there are some sculptures which were never intended to be at eye level. We may choose to put them at eye level because we want to appreciate them like that, but that's not what they were intended to serve, that vision, that angle of vision. And so the implications of the interpretation also change. So for instance, there are certain images of erotic couples and Surasundaris or Apsaras on the walls of Khajuraho. And the interesting thing about them is that they just look like Shalabhanjikas or Surasundaris standing on the temple wall. But only when you go really close to those sculptures, you see that they have nail marks left by their lover, symbolically, that have been carved into their neck or their backs. And they're tiny little crescents. And it was part of the iconography to show that she is in a state of rapture, where she is expressing her dalliance and her mood after lovemaking on those sculptures. Now, nobody could see those nail marks because they were all 20 and 30 feet high up. But it was part of the sculptor's pedagogy, training, because the iconography of that sculpture would not have been complete had those nail marks not been there. And so you begin to ask other kinds of questions, that who was it intended for? Who was the viewing public? Like, why make these little embellishments of these nail marks if it's not there for in our vision? And then you realize that, well, it's for just the tradition. It is part of the pedagogy. It's what makes the sculpture complete. And that's why it's there.
That's such a good example, because again, you're linking in these two vital components of close looking, observing parts of the sculpture that you may not see at first glance, but also its ongoing context, not just its initial context of when it was produced, but how is it used, how is it appreciated, how is it over time. So our next question comes from Lucien. Hello, Lucien. She says, hello, Naman, thank you for a great lecture. How can a museum or gallery label contextualize a difficult, in inverted commas, or controversial object without also running the danger of communicating contemporary political or social bias? The visitor cannot know what influences the museum may be subject to.
Yeah, it's a constant problem. It's what I was responding to. And I think my longer paper, I can do a little screen share perhaps. It's on my academia page. It's called Discourse on a Label, Exposing Narratives of Violence. And it's an open access publication. And it was published by the Collège de France this year. And the other is a more succinct version called Conflict Can Museums Tell Us Why, which came out in Mark in a volume edited by Glenn Lowry called Art and Conflict. I think the biggest service that a museum can do is start using examples in the first instance to show how public statues work. What's the purpose of art in the public sphere? What do these artworks do? Like, why do we put up a certain statue at a roundabout or at a traffic signal or outside a secular space or outside or in a religious space? What's its first mark that the sculpture is doing? And then why are the places? What would they try and communicate? And once we have an understanding of how public statuary operates, how propaganda works through the visual, we become better informed about the processes. So I don't think we can always determine or expect the gallery or the museum to be able to fight the kind of political pressure they may be encountering. But there are intelligent ways for them to at least be able to communicate how this happens, by not necessarily talking about what's happening in their own society, but by maybe taking an example from some other country and say, this is what has happened. And that is so close to what is happening in your own country that it seeks to make the point by default. So there are ways in which the museum can do this if it wants to do this.
Okay, thank you. I've got here a question from our director, Malcolm, who says, having highlighted the importance of considering the diverse local contexts of museums and monuments, what place do you see for the Universal Museum, such as the British Museum, going into the future?
I think the museum is embarking on a major project now, like the educational institution, on being a co-producer of the knowledge that it contains, not just as a keeper of the objects, which, as we have seen in the pandemic, are something that we can, the objects are only something we can access virtually. But even if we were to physically access them, or we are virtually accessing them, the point is that apart from having the responsibility for keeping the objects, the museum has to also become a keeper of the narratives that those objects enable. And the museum has to therefore be equally responsible towards telling these disturbing narratives of decolonization, of repatriation claims, of how the object, what the object's provenance history may be, what kind of political conflict that object has been subjected to, how that very same object is a symbol of national pride for one community or a symbol of national oppression for a different community. There are divergent ways of looking at that very same object. And those divergences have to be showcased. Those multiple stories have to be told that have to accompany the object, because not owning up to them, not telling those stories becomes a problem. So the Universal Museum's real responsibility is going to be able to protect itself from irrelevance, or to protect itself from its endless repatriation claims, is going to only come out of being able to really own up to the many narratives it has enabled. The other thing is that the museum really needs to be safeguarded with autonomy. Protection is required for the museum and the educational institution to be able to protect its autonomy, to be able to own the research that it has enabled, rather than be in a situation where the research is subject to too much political pressure and they're not allowed to say the things that they want to say. So there has to be a way for a certain amount of autonomy in its constitution for the institution that allows it to declare how it has come to know what it has.
So in a way, they need to become more political so that they can claim the narrative rather than it being foisted on with different agendas. They need to not shy away from these different contexts and histories. And yeah. Thank you, Naman. I think I just want to read out a nice comment from Miranda, who says, "Thank you so much for this day. So fascinating and such a joy to be hearing all your insights and celebrating Hetty." I think you probably echo everybody in the audience in that comment. And I think that you're allowed a break now, Naman, and a cup of tea, coffee, something. Right. And I think that's the end of the questions. And thank you again from me for such an excellent talk. And
can I interrupt you, Emily, please? And thank you for moderating so beautifully. And of course, Naman for his brilliant keynote speech. And I'm very proud to be part of that, really. And thank Malcolm as well, if I may just butt in, so to speak, at this point.
Hetty, you are never butting in. This is a day of celebration in honor of your accomplishments.
It's great, exactly, and it's your day. I mean, thank you for having me and allowing me to do this and inviting me. Really, it's very nice to be able to connect with you all. And I keep wishing that we didn't have to keep doing these things virtually. It's awful.
I know.
We'll have to have another one in certain years' time in person.
Completely.
Sorry, don't say that.
Well, I just want to echo the notes of thanks to Naman, to Emily, and indeed again to Hetty for all she's done for the programme. But we'll be hearing more about that anon. So we now have an hour and 15-minute break. We'll reconvene at 1:45 UK time. So in an hour and 15 minutes from now. And that is really the highlight of the day. Apologies, Nama, but it's the chance to hear from Hetty, her reminiscences about the course and her memories. So we'll have a short address from Hetty at that point. Thank you once again to Naman for the wonderful keynote lecture, which, as I said, is such a critically engaged, thought-provoking, and a productively challenging provocation or suggestion towards us to reorientate and rejig our thinking, and to expand on what we do within our field. And I think with resonances that go far beyond your own kind of specialization in Indian art, that have a great deal of meaning for cultures and collections the world over. So thank you once again for this really meaningful contribution to today. And we look forward to seeing all of you back with us in an hour and 15 minutes, when we'll be hearing from Hetty in her address as Director Emerita of the Postgraduate Diploma in Asian Art. Thank you once again to Emily and Naman and Hetty.
Thank you for everybody for turning up. I really, and all sorts of ungodly hours. So thank you so much. Thank you, Naman. See you later.
See you later. Right.